Hi, thank you for that inspiring call to action and for setting the agenda. My name is Parth Vaishnav. I'm on the faculty at the University of Michigan, and I'm going to lead the panel, moderate the panel on Justice40 and implementation. I'll start by introducing our distinguished panelists from the agencies who've joined us today to talk about what their agencies are putting in place in order to implement Justice40. This is to start a conversation with the academic community and with frontline communities to get a grip on what tools are available and what tools are needed in order to implement the Justice40 agenda. So I'll just introduce the panelists in alphabetical order, as it turns out. Crystal Bergemann is the Senior Advisory to the Secretary for Climate at Housing and Urban Development. She's an expert in green and energy efficient affordable housing and has spent much of her career at HUD working to advance green and equitable building priorities across the agency. Prior to her return to HUD, she led Fannie Mae's multifamily affordable housing preservation work with underserved markets and served as an advisor to the company's Environmental, Social, and Governance Division. Crystal holds a master's degree in public administration from New York University, and she focused on water and energy policy. Welcome to the panel, Crystal, and thank you for joining us. Our panelist from the US Department of Agriculture is Bidisha Bhattacharyya. She serves as a senior advisor on climate and conservation at USDA. Previously, she served as the Director for Climate and Energy Policy at the Center for American Progress and Vice President of Emerging Markets at the impact investment firm Village Capital. Bhattacharya has also deployed renewable energy solutions in rural India and spent 4 years on Capitol Hill as Senior Energy and Agricultural Policy Advisor to Senator Al Franken of Minnesota, and as Energy and Agricultural Legislative Assistant for Representative Betty McCollum of Minnesota. Our panelist from the Department of Transport is Christopher Coes. He currently serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. He's also the nominee for Assistant Secretary of Transportation Policy at the Department for Transport. Coes previously served as the Vice President for Land Use and Development for Smart Growth America, a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, a Professor at George Washington University, and Deputy Director and Senior Advisor for the Transportation for America campaign. He's a native of Thomasville, Georgia, and a graduate of St. John's University, where he received both his BA and MA in Government and Politics, specializing in public administration. From the Department of Health and Human Services, we have Arsenio Mataka. Arsenio is the Senior Advisor on Climate Change and Health Equity to the Assistant Secretary for Health. Previously, Arsenio advised California Attorney General Xavier Becerra on environmental policy and law. Prior to joining the California Department of Justice, Arsenio served as a special advisor to California Governor Jerry Brown to help craft climate change legislation. He also served as Assistant Secretary for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs at the California Environmental Protection Agency from 2011 to 2017. Arsenio graduated from Sacramento State University with a bachelor's degree in history and went on to receive his Juris Doctor from Humphreys College School of Law. We also have Tony Reames from the Department of Energy. Tony Reames is the Senior Advisor for the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. He was most recently a Professor of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, where he established the Urban Energy Justice Lab to conduct research and develop solutions on the production and persistence of income, racial, and geographic disparities in energy access, energy affordability, decision-making, and participation. Reames served as a commissioned officer in the US Army Corps of Engineers and worked in both the private and public sectors as a licensed professional engineer. He earned a BS in civil engineering from North Carolina Agriculture and Tech State University, a Master of Engineering Management from Kansas State, and a PhD in Public Administration from the University of Kansas. And from the EPA, we have Matthew Tahada. He joined the EPA in March of 2013 as a career senior executive and director of the Office of Environmental Justice. As director, Matthew leads the environmental justice program's cross-cutting work throughout the EPA and across activities with other federal agencies, states, tribes, local governments, and other stakeholders. Before his career at EPA, Matthew spent over 5 years as executive director of the environmental justice advocacy Air Alliance Houston in the Houston and Texas Gulf Coast areas. Matthew receives his master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Oxford, where he was a member of St. Anthony's College, and a BA in English from the University of Texas at Austin. He then served 2 years in the Peace Corps. He's a native of Fort Worth, Texas, and lives with his wife, Andrea, in Silver Spring, Maryland, and is the proud father of Nia Tejada. Thank you all very much for joining us. I propose that we start by spending the first half hour or so talking about what each of the agencies are doing, what tools, what methods, what data sets they're bringing to bear on the implementation of Justice40. And I figured we'd start with the Department of Energy and with Dr. Tony Reames.
All right, thank you so much, Parth, and thank you to my colleagues from across the federal family for joining us today. And I'll quickly show a couple slides just to walk through how DOE is thinking about our methods and our metrics for implementing Justice40. So we know that when we think about Justice40, Shalonda laid out kind of an introduction to the initiative, 40% of benefits of certain federal investments flowing to disadvantaged communities. And so we kind of broke the implementation into these 3 buckets. And so first we had to figure out, how are we going to measure and track benefits of Justice40? What are the programs that are covered by the Justice40 initiative? And then where are the communities that we want these benefits to flow? And so I'll focus on just those the first and the last bucket. And so Shalonda already mentioned there were 2 definitions given to us in the OMB guidance of how we define disadvantaged communities, either the geographic definition or the kind of common conditions definition. And so unlike some agencies, and as we wait on the rollout of the climate and economic justice screening tool from the White House that will provide the disadvantaged community definition for the full federal government, each agency was given the guidance to develop their own definitions in the interim. DOE did not have a definition, and so we had to go through a process to actually create that. And so we thought about, what have we seen in other screening tools? What are some of the energy-related vulnerabilities that DOE actually has some agency over? And so we divided our cumulative burden definition into 4 buckets. So we have this kind of energy burden bucket that looks at transportation, energy burden, non-connected to grid homes, heating fuel, power outages, duration of outages. We know that we're in this fossil energy transition, and so communities that will be vulnerable from an economic perspective as we transition. So how many coal jobs, how many other fossil energy jobs, the kind of common socioeconomic and demographic characteristics that we see in most screening tools, from food deserts to housing burdens to housing quality to age of populations that are vulnerable. And then these environmental and climate hazards that are very common in communities using like EJ screen. And so you can see our data sources on the right, everything from the census to the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and all of our federal agencies like USDA, Commerce, HUD, and FEMA. And so again, from these 36 indicators, we identified the 20% most disadvantaged census tracts in every state. And so the disadvantaged communities are state relative. And so you saw this map just briefly earlier. But again, we looked at census tracts, but then we also took the holistic understanding of tribal lands as well as our US territories and consider the whole region as disadvantaged. And so then how do we take this understanding of where disadvantaged places are and try to translate that into policy? And so we developed collaboratively 8 policy priorities to help us implement Justice 40, as well as for us to begin to think about metrics to calculate benefits going to disadvantaged communities. And so you can see here, the first 2, we want to decrease energy burden in disadvantaged communities, as well as environmental exposure and burdens. The last 6, we want to increase parity in clean energy technology, access and adoption when it comes to disadvantaged communities versus non-disadvantaged communities, increase access to low-cost capital so people can actually afford to participate in the clean energy transition, clean energy enterprises, creation and contracting for minority and disadvantaged business enterprises, making sure there's participation in the economic benefits of the transition. Also, clean energy jobs, job pipeline and training, energy resilience, and energy democracy. And so the last slide I'll show is how we, some samples of how we translate those policy priorities into actual metrics where we can begin to see if 40% or more of the benefits of our investments are going to disadvantaged communities. And so you can see some metrics like, looking at an intervention that should bring down energy costs. And so can we look at the cost before and after a program intervention? When it comes to pollution, can we look at measurements or models? And that we'll talk about that in the next section, this kind of direct measurement or modeling. Also, when it comes to loans, how many loans are we giving to minority and disadvantaged businesses versus our total loan portfolio, as well as things in the community resilience space, looking at the deployment of storage, of energy storage, and then also how many community groups are participating when it comes to energy democracy. And so again, we can talk about this in the rest of the panel between kind of direct measures and modeling, but just wanted to give a sample of how we started this at DOE. Thank you, Parth. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Tony. Tony, there was a clarifying question which it may make sense to answer before we move on, which had to do with slide 4. What does state relative mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we didn't look at all disadvantaged communities from a national perspective. So like ranking, the worst, the most disadvantaged census tracts across the country. We wanted to look at the most disadvantaged census tracts within states, because if we looked at it nationally, some states would have no disadvantaged census tracts based on our cumulative definition. And so we found the kind of disadvantage within states versus across the whole country.
Perfect. The questions are pouring in. We'll hold them for the last third of our discussion today. But I'd now like to invite Dr. Matthew Tahada from the EPA to speak to us about the EPA's perspective on this.
Hi, thanks so much. And I don't have a PowerPoint for this, but I am going to talk through. We have spent quite a bit of time, obviously, at EPA thinking through our commitments to Justice 40 and how we are going to proceed on those. And we spent quite a bit of time recently, actually, with leadership in preparation for a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council meeting, NEJAC, the advisory council that just advises EPA. A few weeks ago, because the NEJAC is obviously very interested in what are we doing at EPA to ensure that in this historic time where we have, for the first time in our lives, the political leadership with actual resources that can make a difference on the ground, that we're doing everything we can to make sure that we seize this opportunity and actually get those resources on the ground in ways that are going to make positive changes happen for the communities that need them the most. So we have set a very clear ambition for EPA, where we are committing to not just meet but exceed the 40% mandate contained in Justice 40 for EPA. So EPA overall is going to meet and exceed that 40%. And we're making it very clear to our programs at EPA that while the executive order talks about benefits, and we are absolutely going to make commitments around the benefits from each of our programs and ensuring that we exceed 40% of those benefits flowing to communities, we're also going to make that same commitment for investments. And we're going to be very clear that at EPA that we're going to track the dollars. And for me personally, as someone who worked on environmental justice issues and funding issues and other programs for a number of years in Houston before I joined the federal government, that's really where it starts with me. And I think we've heard, from the NEJAC and from the WEJAC and just other EJ leaders and voices, that there is a real desire, and maybe that's not even the right word for it, to see where the dollars go, right? The dollars are so critical, and in some ways, to talk about benefits and say that you're tracking benefits without being able to make that connections to, well, okay, but who received the check, can be a tricky exercise. So at EPA, we're clearly committing to track both of those things. There's going to be some hard work in there for us. A number of our programs that are already part of Justice40 through the pilot program, they do a great job because they have kind of place-based programs where it's been very easy for them to track where do their dollars show up, where do staff show up, where did they spend their time, what is the result of that. Brownfields is a really good example, even though there's some improvements that can be made in that program, which is by its very nature, an EJ-centric program that was designed through a lot of advocacy by EJ advocates back in the 90s and going on from there. But even there's some progress being made there. We're going to have some real challenges in some of our other programs. Some of our programs where a lot of money goes out through EPA, or at least in EPA terms, it still seems like pocket change compared to some of the other agencies that are here with us today. But for EPA, there's some big pockets of money changes hands a number of times before it actually reaches the ground, right? If you're talking about things that go from federal agencies to states, to councils of governments or metropolitan planning organizations, to counties, to cities, to utilities, there can be a lot of transactions in some of our funding programs. So there's going to be some natural limitations potentially in being able to provide the same level of granularity in some programs as we'll be able to in other programs, where it's just a straight up grant and we know where it goes and that'll be easy. But we're committed to wherever we can and within all of our programs, we're gonna get as close to ground as possible, and we're ready to roll up our sleeves and do the hard work of figuring those things out. Although in the same breath, there's besides just kind of the technical or legal challenges that we might encounter in some places, we're also very aware that there's a burden to reporting, and that's something that we're very cognizant of at EPA. That you can start to get into some diminishing returns if we try to be too granular or we try to be too prescriptive in terms of how to track investments and how to track different benefits. So we're trying to balance the accountability and transparency that we want to have across the board with the ability to be flexible, both in terms of the programs that we administer out of EPA, but also be flexible around the realities of our partners, particularly our partners at the state and tribal and local levels. We don't want this to become an unnecessarily burdensome thing for anyone. We want this to really get to a place where we have a level of transparency in terms of where do the investments flow, where do the benefits flow, so that we can all make better choices about where do they actually wind up on the ground and what sort of an impact are they having, and the level of transparency that we're able to provide to communities and to other partners. To me, that transparency is the most direct and maybe the most powerful form of accountability we can have in this process for the long term. So we're very committed both in terms of meeting and exceeding the 40%, doing so for investments and for benefits, and also providing the maximum level of transparency available. We've already created a draft internal thus far. We're still playing with it, an investment tracking map of where our programs are going to show up on the ground. We've shared that with members of the NEJAC with whom we're going to engage on getting that very draft map into a version that we can start to share publicly. It's so early days that we don't really even have an expectation of when that's going to happen. We're going to try to do it as soon as possible, but we're very committed to that. I think that is again, that is the sort of thing that can have a lasting legacy in terms of really changing the way programs operate. and really providing an ability for not just us at the federal level, but with our state partners, with our tribal partners, with our local partners, and ultimately, sitting down across the table from community members who need to see this change, being able to show that over the long haul. This is a massive endeavor, but I think we've made some pretty simple, straightforward commitments that are going to really help us year over year change what we do, learn from those changes, and continuously improve our ability to drive those investments and drive those benefits to the communities that both need and deserve our focus, our attention, and our resources to flow to them to fix the generational legacy issues affecting their health and affecting their environments. So I'll stop there. I look forward to hearing from my other panelists and engaging in some dialogue.
Thank you very much for that, Matthew. We'll move now to the Department of Transport. Christopher Coes, would you like to talk us through the work that the Department of Transport is doing in order to implement Justice40?
Absolutely, and I'm going to, only because my colleagues at DOE showed all of us up, I'm going to put a presentation on the screen. Hopefully it's viewable, just confirm that you guys can see the
screen. You had extra time to pull it up.
I did. But really quickly, is the screen viewable? Good. I think the couple of things that, and I'm really actually just first and foremost, thank you for the invitation. And I'm always excited to be in company with me and my colleagues here from the other agencies who I rely on a lot at the Department of Transportation as we move this work forward, particularly around how do we achieve the principles of Justice40 and the larger goal of decarbonization in an equitable manner. As my colleagues have mentioned before, many of our agencies, as part of the Justice40 initiative, really looked inward in terms of how do we want to use the data that we currently have to help define what is a disadvantaged, underserved community. And for the Department of Transportation, oftentimes we look at things as air pollutants and proximity to vehicle travel, but really we challenged our department to really come up with what we believe is, for the first time, a true definition around transportation disadvantage. And as part of that, through a lot of the discussions we were having with academia, the conversation we were having internally, and even also some of the lessons we've learned from other agencies, we recognize, and I think this is what the literature has shown, is that transportation is not just a asset in of itself, but it has an impact on the built environment, which then also can create disadvantage, not only in terms of place, but also with population. And what you see here is our way of actually taking the lessons of economic disadvantage, resilience disadvantage, social disadvantage, but recognizing that transportation actually plays a unique role in all of it and how we unpackage that. As part of that, we then begin to identify, as this definition of benefit, what are the benefits of transportation? Oftentimes, the argument is like, hey, you put $1 of highway or transit or investment in port, that is a benefit. But actually, we took a much broader and actually comprehensive view that transportation investment in of themselves have an economic lens. They have a transportation mobility lens, but we also recognize they have an impact on environment and the community, and be able to communicate the true benefit. Because one of the things, the lessons we've learned through our investments, that while we may say a highway investment can have an economic benefit for a particular community, when you take a larger snapshot or analysis, you can find that actually that benefit was actually a net benefit for the larger economy and also for specific communities. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure as part of our deliberation of building out the data set, the information and definition around benefits, is that we're actually capturing the true benefit, the true cost of these investments. Now, as you can see here, and I think it's been noted by all of my colleagues, or will be noted by my colleagues, is that this is a huge undertaking. And one of the things that, one of the data elements that we're constantly learning is that all the data that are tied to each of the dots you see here within our methodology can be very static, can be very old, right? And actually in many cases do not get down to the granular street level. Oftentimes a lot of the data is at a census tract or a regional, and recognizing that investments like the ability to being a walking path or a trail or a new transit line has more than a regional impact, but it can be very localized, and be able to, from a policy decision making, be able to understand those differences is so key. And that is a gap that I think we have to continue to refine over time. But despite that, as the Department of Transportation, who right now sits in a unique situation because of the new $1.2 trillion investment as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the fact that the Department of Transportation, we are represent over half, about $650 billion of those investments, we have found that Justice40 and equity must serve as the center of the implementation of this historic bipartisan infrastructure law. Just within the Department of Transportation, we have identified over 40 programs that represents about $207 billion in DOT funding as part of our Clean Transportation Program under Justice40. That is significant. Now, with that, we have been taking steps over the last several months to ensure that we're embedding, and actually the last year, to make sure that we're embedding equity and Justice40 in these programs, both from the discretionary side, where we've incorporated equity as a standard in many of our programs, but also beginning to have how we intersect, and this is one of the things that has been something I've been decided working with my colleagues, is that Justice40 doesn't sit in its own silo. It is actually part of the larger tool and strategy of the administration's equity agenda, right? How do we assure that Justice40 is meeting the overall goals as part of the Justice40 of equity? And as part of that, we've now gone to the second phase, which is now we have all the data, we have these mapping tools, but actually how can we take this mapping tool and the methodology and apply it to 40 programs that actually honestly look very different from each other. They have different programmatic outcomes, but we want to be able to demonstrate both at the place level, at the population level, but also as part of a national policy discussion, key outcomes and benefits. And that is something I'll talk about in a second, and how we are trying to address that. Now, as I mentioned before, there are many ways of how we are defining the benefits, and as it's been noted, we are working with our colleagues in CEQ and OMB to continue to do that refinement. But at the Department of Transportation, as we looked across all of the indicators that we believe we wanted to track at a program level, we identified 5 that we believe every program needs to speak to as part of our ongoing annual reporting. Those 5 are around safety. Are our dollars, whether it's investing in ports, whether it's investing in our airports, whether it's investing in transit and highway, are we addressing our North Star at the department, which is improving safety and reducing fatalities on our roadways and our transportation system? If our transportation system is not safe, the Department of Transportation, we're not doing our job. The second indicator that we are using in terms of grounding all of our programs is economic competitiveness. As part of our equity agenda, we identify wealth creation as a key pillar. Within our Justice40 work, we are looking how are we ensuring that in those communities that we've identified, how are we ensuring that small businesses and disadvantaged businesses are actually increasing? How are we tracking that? Also, one of the things that the bipartisan infrastructure law has given us as a department is that now through our federal dollars, local and state DOTs, transit agencies, and grant recipients can now use their dollars to promote local hire. That is going to be a key aspect, a key data point that we're going to be tracking with our dollars. And the third benefit that we're are definitely tracking is around resilience. And one of the issues that you all know is one thing to actually think about how do we get benefit, but we have to recognize that we're in a climate crisis. And we have to ensure that we're building a new infrastructure system that not only addresses the harm, addresses the environmental justice harm that has been done in the past, but ensuring that the infrastructure we're building for the future can actually survive in a new future as part of this climate crisis. And one of the things that we're tracking is how many communities, particularly disadvantaged communities, are being a part of resiliency plans that localities are now going to be able to be funded through some of the bipartisan infrastructure law, for example, our carbon and protect dollars. And how we're also going to be tracking how each project reduces overall risk from natural hazards overall. The final two, which is where I find a lot of our work and a lot of our staff being very excited around in terms of driving home the Justice40 outcome is particularly on transportation and when it comes around access. Transportation has a disproportionate impact on our emissions. And we recognize that, we have a unique and actually a responsibility to be on the forefront of the climate crisis, particularly in terms of reducing emissions. But one way we know we can do that is actually giving individuals more options to move around the built environment other than the car. And that means, how are we ensuring that our investments are creating more access, more affordable access, and climate-friendly access to all Americans? And that includes our bus. We have significant inventory resources going to expanding public transportation, the greatest investment in public transportation ever. We now have new programs that's going to really drive how to reconnect communities that have maybe historically infrastructure that not only have high environmental justice impact, but actually have divided communities. How can we actually provide more mobility options in particularly rural and tribal communities? Now we're actually trying to push our entire department to be able to track that. And that is new for us as a department. And of course, as I said before, the last benefit that we're tracking is emission reduction. One of the things I'll just end on is that I think one of the challenges and recognitions that we are finding as an agency, as we implement Justice40, is that you can't just turn the light switch. You can't just wake up one day and say, okay, we're going to do Justice40. Turns out, as my colleagues who have a lot more programs at DOT recognize, that each program is different. And when you talk about formula versus discretionary, there are a lot of things we know we can do in the discretionary bucket very easily in terms of data tracking and even driving dollars. But when it comes to formula, where we're actually giving dollars directly to states or directly to NPOs or transit agencies, we have to have a different set of tools, right, to actually achieve the Justice40 goals. And as part of that, as a department, we have been taking what's called a phase-in approach. Phase one has really been emphasizing that we can actually drive in the benefits, universal across the department, whether it's discretionary, particularly. Phase two, we are now learning and engaging the methodology with our new bipartisan infrastructure law programs, would then lead into phase four, which is essentially what lessons have we learned, what conversations are we currently having with state DOTs and NPOs, what resources do they need, technical capacity, data platforms, stakeholder engagement, technical assistance that will allow those entities to also adopt the Justice40 initiative in themselves. And that is an open question, right? And luckily for us, we are hearing, particularly from state DOTs and NPOs and transit agencies, a lot of receptivity and energy and interest in supporting that. Now, I will use this as an example because this is where, for the Department of Transportation, where a majority of our funding go through formula, this is just a snapshot of a joint effort that we did with the Department of Energy as part of our rollout of our EV charging network. One key aspect of this program is that state DOTs had to present to DOE and DOT through our joint office a plan. And so as part of this, Justice40 is, again, not a requirement of our national EV charging program, but what we figure out a way is actually embed the principles of Justice40 into the program. And one of the ways we did that is said, look, state DOTs, as you are mapping out your EV charging locations, you should use our disadvantaged mapping tool to do the following. One, target stakeholder engagement. And we want to see where you're targeting. Two, when you're doing outreach to minority business and the like, or in generating small business and disadvantaged enterprises, here are the communities that we want you to prioritize and tell us how you're using them. And then lastly, we're asking and we're using some of our own legal authority, like our Title VI, some of our civil rights, to actually effectually ensure that the investments that are going, even though it may not be under the Justice40 lens, is actually supporting the larger equity agenda. Again, this is just one example of how we're trying to use Justice40 for programs that may not necessarily have full control within our department, but we know it requires a partnership. Now, with that being said, I'll leave this here. There are a lot of gaps in our methodology and approach of Justice40, but one of the things I think we're looking forward to partnering with academia around is really the last bullet here. Transportation hasn't been part of the discussion around transportation and cost burden. And that is something that we, as Justice40, has really revealed to us, that how are our investments ensuring that we're lowering the costs for everyday Americans, whether it's their access, whether it's how they get to and from work, but also how we can ensure that goods and services can come to citizens cheaply, more effectively, more efficiently, and cheaply, is going to be key. And that's an area that we know we have to work with many of you moving forward. So again, we're really excited about this opportunity and look forward to the Q&A that's later on today.
Thank you very much, Christopher. That was an excellent overview of the Department of Transport's activities in that area. It was really fascinating to see just how many aspects of equity transportation touches mapped out like that. So thank you very much for that. Shall we now move on to the Department for Housing and Urban Development? And yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. Are you able to see this slide here? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So my name is Crystal Bergemann.
Sorry, we're seeing the we're seeing your notes and not the
display settings at the top.
Yeah, I think if you swap it, that should work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So I also, wanted to thank you all for inviting me to speak today, and I'm honored to be on this panel with my colleagues. And I really reiterate a lot of what they have said. So I won't literally reiterate a lot of what they said in the interest of time. We are at HUD very committed to Justice40, to environmental justice. It's core to a lot of what we do, and we are grappling with a lot of the same issues around how do we make sure that we're providing the data, tracking the information, showing that we're making sure that these benefits flow to the right communities, but without increasing the burden that already exists on our grantees and our sub-grantees. And at HUD in particular, we have been doing a lot of this work in a lot of our programs related to disadvantaged communities in various formats in most of what we do. So, most of our work is targeted towards a subset of disadvantaged communities, either defined geographically or also defined in ways that's sort of a non-geographic way. So members of a community that might be outside of a geographic area, but part of a particular group, part of a tribal organization, part of a public housing residents, for example, may be considered a disadvantaged group, even though, regardless of the geography. So we're thinking through some of those issues and some of those ways that we can make sure that we continue to support this work, but while minimizing kind of extra burden and parsing out kind of how we define those disadvantaged communities. But I do want to share, so beyond just decarbonization, which we are focused on a lot, the disadvantaged communities in the Justice40 program is also focused on affordable housing, legacy pollution, as Shalanda mentioned at the beginning, a variety of efforts beyond just energy and climate. And again, that's a lot of what we do. So we've got several covered programs, our Native American Block Grant programs, Native Hawaiian programs, public housing, health hazards, choice neighborhoods, our community development block grant programs, our disaster resilience programs, rental assistance demonstration, and then all of our insurance programs through our federal FHA insured homes, both on our single family and our multifamily, in addition to our lead hazard control. So it's a very wide range of programs at HUD that we're working on that fit under the Justice40 bucket and fit broadly under the environmental justice bucket. So instead of taking a lot of time to talk about the details, I did want to just share a couple of tools that we have that this group and these participants may not be aware of. I know a lot of folks are experts on energy poverty, energy decarbonization, but want to make sure that that everybody has tools available related to HUD's programs as well. So could potentially create some great synergies in terms of connecting those two. So this one is the community assessment reporting tool that's open for anyone to use. You can, and we'll share these slides. So you can go to this this cart, HUD.gov/cart tool. And in this tool, you can see for any particular geography, what are the HUD programs that exist in that area. So you can zoom in and see CP. So for example, this one is clicked on CBD grants. So you can see what are the community development block grants, what are the home programs, how much money is in this area, what that looks like. There's a whole range beyond this. What are the rental assistance look like in that particular area? And you can create your own report for a particular geography or for several geographies. So this is Saginaw City in Michigan, but it can be for anywhere in the country. So this could be a really good way to connect some of the other data points that the other agencies have or that researchers may have in this area. So for example, you can zoom in further on mortgage insurance. This shows hospitals that are financed, single family homes that are financed with FHA properties. In this example, you can see that the west side of the city has significantly more FHA financing than the east side of the city. So you can really dig into some of these things in different places. I also wanted to share this other data set. This is our storefront, and this has a wealth of information related to geospatial data that is available to any researcher. And you can find that at huduser.gov. And in this set of data and geospatial data, you can choose from any of these 10 different categories. So some of these things that might be in particular interest to folks here working on Justice40 and environment. So down in the bottom right, there's disaster response and recovery. There's rental assistance programs. There's location affordability. There's all sorts of programs that we have mapped. So just to zoom in one of these, the rental assistance category actually has 88 separate results that are mapped. So you can see multifamily properties that are mapped, fair housing assistance programs that are mapped, et cetera. And then when you go to the map, it shows you exactly where those programs are. Obviously, this is all of our multifamily properties that we support. You can zoom in further to see additional details on all of these things. And you can download files if you'd like to sort of combine and do work to combine different types of categories and see where are there overlaps or where there are not overlaps, and to create some interesting work. So that's a lot of the work and sort of the databases that we're starting to look at, but we're also looking to see how these coordinate with the tool that's been in beta that perhaps many of you seen or will see later in terms of the CJEST economic justice screening tool. So that hopefully these can be complementary resources. This just shows you can zoom in and find additional detail about the types of investments in each of these areas. And then finally, just wanted to add one additional tool here, which is a picture of subsidized houses. So you can actually zoom in by program. Again, I'll share the slides with the URL, but you can see based on census tract, based on state, based on public housing agency, particular programs, and then the categories of assistance for those programs. So this one you can see in Saginaw, Michigan, there are about almost 1,200 subsidized units. You keep going, you can see more information about those households in terms of household income, household makeup, presence of disability, also race information. So a lot of very detailed information that can be used to combine together for these data sets. So I just wanted to take my couple of minutes allotted here just to share those three data sources that I think when we combine all of our efforts can really help make make a difference in trying to figure out how do we track and make sure these investments are going in the places where they're deserved. And so that's it. I'm going to yield the rest of my time and pass it back to Parth.
Thank you very much, Crystal. That was fascinating. There's lots of questions already about where people can access these tools. So we'll collect the links from you and share them with participants or archive them in some way. So thank you very much for that. We'll move over now to the US Department of Agriculture and Bidishabhattacharya. Bidisha, would you like to walk us through what USDA is doing to implement Justice40?
Certainly, and I apologize in advance. Can you all hear me okay? My audio has been a little strange today, so.
We can hear you.
Okay. I'm going to keep my remarks short because I know we want to get to questions, but I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview of the USDA and our work on equity and environmental justice, which we're really, integrating together through our approach across the whole department. It's not often, I don't think USDA is top of mind for folks always when it comes to issues of environmental justice or deep decarbonization, but we do have a lot of, touch points across the department. We have colleagues here from DOE and, at USDA we do a lot in rural energy, so our rural utility service, we do solar energy through our programs, through another agency we have called the Rural Business Cooperative Service. We have a rural housing service, so our HHS colleagues, we have a lot of interesting synergies there. And rural development also does quite a bit on water infrastructure, transportation, et cetera. So we've got a lot just within that mission area, but our Justice40 work is, spans much broader. So the Forest Service sits within USDA, so we've been thinking a lot about the 10-year forest strategy that was just launched, forest fire strategy that was just launched, and how to make sure that the most vulnerable communities are prioritized through that effort. And it's an enormous undertaking over 10 years to fight the increasingly worse wildfires that we're seeing every year. And then we have Justice40 programs happening within our agriculture programs. And so we took a pretty wide view when it came to Justice40 and not looking strictly at like energy or infrastructure necessarily, but anywhere where you could see programs that could be better targeted toward underserved communities or populations. And so some of our work, for example, in our agriculture programs are not place-based. They are more looking at populations, particularly underserved producers, and how and farm workers, which spans across a lot of different agencies, but those or tribal communities. So there's a lot of places where our Justice40 work is not necessarily geographically focused, but is really thinking more broadly about disparate populations that are really relevant and who the department has had a lot of touch points with in the past and not always the best history, frankly. So we have over 65 covered programs in Justice40. Our data and methodologies are very much, they differ across our agency across our department based on the agency because of the diversity that I'm talking about. So the programs that focus on producers, agricultural producers, are using or have developed different methodologies over time than, say, the forestry folks. And then I would say most kind of out front as our rural development mission area, which has developed a mapping tool, which I am right alongside EPA here with no slides, but I will share the information after this happily to anyone who wants to see it. But there's a mapping tool that Rural Development which houses the Rural Utilities Service and many of our other kind of energy and infrastructure work. They've developed tools to identify underserved communities using a variety of data sets. So the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, Distressed Community Index, which comes out of the Economic Innovation Group. They've looked at persistent poverty communities, which are communities that have had 20% poverty consistently over the last 30 years. And they've layered a bunch of different data to use for internal facing and external facing tools that we're happy to share and have a conversation about. We know that we're working in the department right now to try to get these folks to all talk to each other, because a lot of this has been happening in silos. For example, our Natural Resources Conservation Service, which touches producers to do conservation on the ground, is now thinking about how to better serve
underserved producers and underserved communities through, we don't always think about the kind of downstream impacts of some of this great conservation that happens through NRCS on water quality and things like that. We think about it in the place that it's happening. And so starting to think about how do you actually map and look downstream or downwind to where a producer is implementing these conservation practices that are better for the water, better for the air, better for the soil, and how does it actually translate to communities downstream. So trying to take some of that place-based thinking and approach and put it into programs that haven't historically thought of it that way. There's a lot of work to be done, and we could certainly use help. We also have a whole bunch of research agencies at USDA. So we have the Agricultural Research Service, we have NASS, we have the ERS, the Economic Research Service, we have NIFA, which works a lot with land-grant universities and university extension. So we're harnessing or, working with them to harness a lot of that brain power to help kind of backstop a lot of our Justice40 work. But I know even for themselves, our research agencies are also part of Justice40, and I think it would be really helpful to have a broader conversation with and get some inputs on how to inform a research agenda that is relevant for particularly rural America. I think a lot of times rural is forgotten in these conversations, and there's a lot of underserved communities in rural as well as urban, so we want to make sure we are thinking about that. But as we are building even these kind of in-house tools that have been built, there are definitely data gaps and understanding of where rural communities, really have those needs and what's going on. And so I think from the data side and also sort of just helping us think about research questions and how we should be dedicating some of the research programs that are happening and incorporating some of these questions into our research dollars. That's another gap that we see at USDA. So a lot of really good work being done, and we're still certainly just starting to put all the pieces together, and also working, across the federal family that's represented here. So I will stop there, but look forward to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, lots of questions about links to the tools and data sets, which we'll reach out for. And finally today, from the Department of Health and Human Services, Arsenio Mataka. Arsenio, would you like to walk us through what HHS is doing to implement justice?
Yeah, Parth, I'll be brief since I want to, allow you to sort of do some dialogue here. But if you thought EPA was the baby of the bunch with respect to, infrastructure dollars, we are truly probably the baby of the bunch when it comes to these funds. As it relates to Justice40, I think we had like 3 programs, one program that was actually in the infrastructure bill, but others. So we had one program that brings sanitation construction projects to American, Indian, and Native Alaskan or other indigenous areas and throughout the nation. That's $700 million. That's going to go out every for the next 5 years, and we have the low-income home energy assistance program that provides folks with some relief when it comes to paying their bills. And we also have a worker training program that does some environmental worker training and, on remediation and other types of projects. It's likely that all those programs will likely achieve, under this rather loose definition of disadvantaged communities, 100%, for either on one of those prongs. And so for us, we've taken a step back and we have a little bit of luxury of looking at what transportation or what energy or what EPA and others are doing with respect to drilling down to the benefits and making them meaningful. I thought what Dr. Reames and Chris Coes presented with respect to their progress and how they drill down on the benefits is exactly where, as we as an entire federal agency, need to be. So Chris, when you mentioned, you mentioned getting down to like, does this project reduce wait times or bus wait times? These are the fundamental questions that we have to answer for the people to show that there's a benefits. Because I agree with Matt. The first Matt at EPA, the first layer here is being accountable and transparent, showing people where the dollars went to. That's the first step. But then the second quick question will be, okay, now what were those benefits really realized or for the intended purpose that you all thought? And that requires really strong frameworks that that several of my colleagues have put together and shown. And so if you're thinking like, why is this happening in a fragmented way, I would encourage you to sort of be able to see that sometimes you need to work through your own agencies. These are big agencies to come up with frameworks for your own before we could look at a broader picture. But I think as somebody has suggested in the comments that day will soon be coming. And we will see this sort of a combining of these very really important benefit metrics to help, because the bottom line is this, is that surely Justice40 was monumental, but it won't be the last major investment in disadvantaged communities. And so that's why here at HHS, we're sort of dealing with our infrastructure programs. We're also building our infrastructure at HHS, people infrastructure, for the next or Justice40, or for just the progress on environmental justice at HHS, because HHS is the largest grant maker in the federal government. And so whatever groundwork we lay for Justice40 will pay off in a very big way in those other pots of money, whether it's research or human services. And that will allow us to achieve the sort of spirit of Justice40 in different ways that go beyond the sort of the definition that we use today. And so I would say that for the academics or for research, you all have a very important role to play when it comes to like what Chris just pointed about, some of those gaps. Also, you have convening powers I think could help. Not everybody has Bezos coming in and dropping in a lot of money to convene folks. There are communities that need help, and you can be conveners of space. In California, when we went through this process, that was very important to have the universities and researchers convene folks that helped us help the federal government explain what we're doing as we're here today, but then also allow for those collaborations where appropriate and where you can sink into. So I would encourage you all to look at HUD's tools, look at Transportation and Energy's tools, and see where you can contribute and refine. That would be helpful. And finally, I would say that, what can you do? There is a form of technical assistance that you all can provide, not for us, but for communities. You all can help them as we know, as Bidisha mentioned, in rural communities and under communities that lack governmental capacity to sort of participate in this. It's not a money grab, but it's, in this process, they need folks to help them enhance their projects. And the government isn't going to do it all. And these foundations aren't going to do it all. And so you may have a certain expertise that can help a project get over the hump when it comes to discretionary, funding projects. And, or you may be able to have assist your own state in thinking about how they could go about better reallocating funding based on these things. And so HHS is learning from our colleagues here, but I would imagine in the very near future, we're going to have a very important role to play in all this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Arsenio. So I'd like to sort of open up the discussion a little bit, and I really appreciate that several of the panelists have been answering the Q&A in the Q&A section. I'm going to try and group some of the questions that sort of speak to a common theme, and by far the one that's come up most is the definition of disadvantaged communities. Different agencies currently have slightly different definitions. Some of them are interim, and of course the climate and economic justice screening tool, which is a sort of beta version right now. But the questions have been around, will this tool replace them? Will the different agencies' definitions continue to be applied? So if the panelists could speak to that, that would be wonderful. And a sort of follow-on question from that is that given that the definition of disadvantaged communities is in flux, and also given that the scope of Justice40 is being determined, how are the federal agencies going about providing guidance to the states?
Very carefully.
Can I just say real quick, since I was last, Parth, is that HHS will also have another screening tool coming out to add to the sort of the pile of screening tools. And again, I don't want it to be lost, my point to be lost, that try to look beyond. There's a lot in Justice 40, but try to understand, to look beyond Justice 40 and understand that each of our agencies will need a definition that works for us beyond Justice 40, in the scope of Justice 40, to drive the meaningful environmental justice work that will be long-lasting beyond Justice 40. So if I want CDC to prioritize investigations for public health concerns, I likely, will use a screening tool that means something a little bit closer to HHS than the other tool. And these are 14008 requires agencies to make environmental justice part of their mission beyond Justice 40. And so these tools will be necessary to sort of drive that other work that after people are done looking at the dollars, the other piece of real policy work that will be helped by these tools. But maybe one of my colleagues could answer the other questions since they're the main implementers.
I'll try. I think I beat Chris by a fraction of a second of getting my hand up. I wanted to build on what Arsenio said, and then I'll try to answer Parth's question a little bit. So absolutely, and I put this in one of the answers to one of the Q&A questions that came in. I think one of the best, most important, lasting, durable things that is happening right now with the climate and economic justice screening tool and whatever the White House eventually decides in terms of the mandate to use or how to use or whatever else, the White House will come up with that. Regardless of that, I think the fact that there is an incredible and explosive growth in realization that we have data available that can help us make more equitable and just decisions. And it's really not that hard to put that data in a place where it is transparent and it is meaningful for us at the federal level, for our state and tribal and local partners, for utilities, for the private sector, and ultimately for the community to see that and to use it to help make decisions or to help hold us accountable for the decisions we make. And to Arsenio's point, there is no one tool that is going to answer all of our questions. But what people are increasingly understanding is, oh, this data is there. If I just take this data set and this data set and do it at this scale, wow, suddenly I understand the implications of the decision I have before me, and I can make a better decision. I can answer the question. I can form a more precise question, and I can get a much better answer that gets resources or gets benefits on the ground to the places where they're most needed, where they're going to be most effective. I think regardless of political cycles and everything else, or the discourse that happens wherever in this town or other towns, I think this is the sort of change happening within government and within policy that will continue to allow us to improve how we do things. And to your point, Parth, or to the original question, I think that's actually one of the more exciting frontiers of working with states and working with local government, because so often, guidance is tough. Thinking that we have the answer for all 50 states, or that we have the answer for the tens or hundreds of thousands of municipalities across the United States, it's really tough to issue so many pages of guidance that works everywhere across the United States. We are doing that, and we have already done that at EPA, particularly in our water programs. We've already sent out a couple of pieces of guidance to every governor of every state and territory in the United States, letting them know, here's our priorities, here's what we're trying to get to, here's our plan for doing it. So there's formal efforts like that at least at EPA have happened. I'm sure there are other places around the government where we've tried to offer a very clear point on the horizon that we're all going to work towards. But the data and these tools, I think, provide a platform within which all of our partners can start to really understand the implications of governing and how the reality on the ground has not been serviced by that governing for a very long time, and can help us to change the way that we implement programs, the policies that we decide on, to better match the realities and the needs on the ground where our resources are most deserving of showing up.
Absolutely. Are there other agency perspectives on this question of the definition of DAC, or does that cover it?
I have my hand up, so I'll
Yes,
keep it short because I
please.
think we want to get other questions in. I will make a slight amendment because I agree with everything that's been said, but I want to make a slight amendment. I actually think one of the most transformative elements about Justice40 is that it forces the government to think in real time data, because the market, and someone who's worked with the private capital market, I can tell you there's enough real estate data that shows what makes a thriving community in terms of transportation access, health benefits, climate benefits, because your market has already shown if you're in a resilient, safe, equitable place, it's actually really expensive to live there. That is what the market is telling us right now. What we now have is that the government is finally asking itself this fundamental question of the data that we have, how do we take X number of census tracts that have been designated as disadvantaged, and how do we move them to being thriving American communities? And I think that arc is the place where I think the greatest transformation is. It's like, for us knowing where we need to get these communities to go, how are we making sure we can get there in a place that is like within our generation, right? And that is an investment strategy, that is a policy strategy, and that is a political strategy that communities from the bottom up have to embrace. And that is a question. If you are a disadvantaged community today, can we get to a place where you're thriving within a generation? And now we have the data that kind of shows how we can map that out to get to that place. The second thing I will emphasize here is I think the lesson that Department of Transportation is learning is that regardless of the universalism of the data that we may get from the White House, is that we recognize that there is going to be, to Matt's point and to Arsenio's point, is going to be a neat need for us to look at our programs distinctly, because many of our programs are just doesn't plug into that one map. There might be like, there is an airplane that lands, right? There is noise that comes with that, but it also has a clear direct need of how we collect data about how we get goods and services to communities, right? So it's like the whole universal, and I think that's a place where we're going to continue to be modeling and providing more data and literature around. So I think the best part about Justice40 is forcing us to actually really find ourselves where the real estate market and the private market already is. Great places is in high demand. And we have for too long, we've underinvested in places to get there, and we can now have a map and investment strategy to get there.
Thank you. And I think that series of answers has also answered another question, which is that how do you have this effort sort of transcend and outlive the priorities of just one administration? So that is, it's really valuable that you've answered that question also. Another sort of theme of questions has been, there's been a significant focus on trying to track the dollars and recognizing that is obviously the first step. How do you get from there to impact? How do you get from there to metrics? And as a related question, to what extent have the communities themselves been involved in developing those metrics to ensure that they're meaningful to those communities?
I'll jump in really quickly about kind of the stakeholder engagement process that we undertook at DOE. So we put together our Justice40 research team, again, out of our Office of Economic Impact and Diversity, and definitely did some of the, kind of stakeholder engagement with frontline community groups to talk about, their needs, their wants, mixing that with, all the great research probably from folks on this call, identifying disparities in the energy system, right? Because that's what, we kind of have domain over. And we continue those conversations as we've, talked about our disadvantaged community identification, as we've talked about implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. We just hired a senior advisor on stakeholder engagement recently throughout our program offices. So part of that kind of institutionalization of energy justice, equity, and environmental justice across the department. We have energy justice advisors in different program offices. Many of the program offices are starting to hire stakeholder engagement folks. And so it is building a new kind of network and framework of individuals that aren't just in one place, but can look at the different programs and different needs of programs and the different communities that are impacted by programs, and have like a senior staff person in that role to kind of lead that effort. And so we have a slide that we show. It takes the federal government, the state government, community groups, the philanthropic organizations, all working together to make this real. And so that's kind of the approach we take at DOE.
Right. Another question was, and this speaks to the theme of the conference, which is there are areas where agencies, where there are synergies between what the agencies do. So for example, the example that came up in chat was housing and urban development and the energy efficiency of affordable housing and the DOE. There's clearly a scope for the agencies to work jointly together. I'm sure there are similar synergies with the Department of Transport and other agencies. So could you speak a bit to how those synergies are being exploited within the federal government, Crystal?
Sure, I'll jump in on that. And I will say, so I've worked for HUD for about a decade, and Department of Energy has always been a great partner, but with this administration in particular, I feel like we've got a real focus on making sure to maximize those synergies in a lot of ways. So for example, with the infrastructure law that just passed, an infrastructure bill, HUD does not have direct funding in that bill, but we know that Department of Energy through their weatherization has a significant amount of funds. And so we've been working at HUD and Department of Energy to make sure that we can, that those weatherization funds can easily flow to multifamily building properties, and that there are easy ways to sort of certify if somebody is eligible for HUD assistance, then they should be eligible for weatherization from an income standpoint. And we're also working to do things like, make it easier to address other problems. If a weatherization professional goes in to do weatherization, but they find mold or they find other issues, are there HUD funds that we can put towards those efforts? So that's something we're working closely at, and also just working with Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office and other offices to see, how can we make sure that we're using that expertise in bringing it to those places that really, need that equitable decarbonization and the energy justice, which are the people that HUD serves. So I don't know if Tony, you've got more to add, but there's always more partnership that can be done. We're always excited to do it.
Yeah, I'll jump in really quick. That's a really great example, Crystal. And another DOE and HHS example is looking at community solar potential and seeing if we can use LIHEAP dollars to actually provide prescriptions to subscriptions, not prescriptions, subscriptions to low-income households to participate in community solar. And so that takes the technical potential research that our Solar Energy Technology Office does with a real program that benefits disadvantaged communities and trying to increase that parity in clean energy technology adoption.
Since you mentioned that, I'll just jump into, we just announced at HUD that multifamily assisted properties, and I put this in the chat, but participants in DC can participate in the DC Solar for All program, which will lower their utility bills without it impacting their residents' housing costs, essentially. So we're working to try to expand that to other places too.
Matthew?
I actually wanted to raise something else that I saw in the question and answer, but didn't want to take us off of this if anybody else wanted to talk about this question. But I was hoping to raise another issue in response to some of the stuff in the Q&A.
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I know that's moderator prerogative, so I'm stepping in front of you.
No.
I appreciate it, Parth. So a couple. There's been a couple things in the chat, and this is something that's not a surprise to anybody, right? I think all of us recognize, and the folks on the ground more than any recognize, that there's one huge hole in the middle of all of this that we're all staring at that's called capacity, right? The capacity of lots of folks in this space, whether it is the community members on the ground or our local partners, whether that's utilities or cities or even, you know, states. There's a huge need for all levels of capacity, for tailored capacity, for specific programs and how to make them work. There's also just a huge shared need for capacity across the entire United States on the basics of engaging communities, applying for grants, leveraging different funding streams, doing so equitably, right? Making sure that people of color own businesses and women own businesses, and you know that they're in there getting actual checks to do the work. And there's a huge need for that. And one of the things I think a lot of us were last year really hopeful for was in the Build Back Better agenda, when it was a thing, there was a bunch of money in there just for that general capacity building. And personally, just speaking for me, like that for me was so critical in the middle of all of this to be able to provide that capacity building, and we didn't get it, right? And in some ways, we got all of this infrastructure money now, but we didn't get that flexible capacity building money that could sit in the middle of all those things. That hasn't stopped us. I mean, not having that at the same time that the infrastructure passed is a barrier, but there's still a huge commitment that a number of us are already working on. A number of us are actually going to spend a significant chunk of time together next week trying to work through this issue, because we do have some resources. We're trying to figure out how to best leverage the resources that we have at hand to provide as much of that capacity building as possible. It's not going to be as easy or as quick or as satisfying if we just got, you know, $250 million to do it. But that was the decision that was made. So we're trying our best to make chicken salad out of chicken. Is that the saying? But within that, there was another question too about, well, okay, so all this money flows into communities and all these things get fixed, and what the hell are you going to do so that the folks that you're trying to fix all these things for still live there in 5 years or 10 years and don't just get displaced, don't just get gentrified out of there, right? To me, that goes right back to that same point. And I don't think it's a whole answer. I don't think it's maybe even the most important answer, but I think the most powerful answer we have right now is that if we do all this without lifting the capacity of the community that is receiving these benefits, without lifting the capacity of the community to not just help us design our interventions right now, but to elucidate a vision of what they want to see in the future of their community and have the capacity to long-term, you know, hold government accountable and keep working on programs and keep working with resources to keep building towards that future for the folks that live there now. I think a lot of us would agree, you know, a lot of the stuff we do, even if it touches down into places we need right now, it's not gonna matter 10 years from now, because especially with the way housing and other things are working, those things are pretty dynamic, and that whole community might not be there in a decade or less. So that's part of why so many of us are committed, even though we don't have the most awesome setup for it, to figuring out how to drive that capacity to the ground as quickly as we can in as meaningful a way as we can.
Thank you, Matt. That was literally, the question of capacity was literally going to be the next one that I was going to ask. So
Awesome.
Great that there was a meeting mindset. Arsenio?
Parth, yeah, on capacity, I mean, for the people online, you know, when we did this in California, we had many years to sort of build that, as Matt was, you know, alluding to. Here, you know, this thing was put together rather quickly. And so there's some challenges with public participation, capacity building. You know, there were definitely challenges. On displacement and gentrification, I would say that, you know, when we were rolling it out in California, the California climate investments, I think, you know, my friend in East LA, you know, basically told me, you know, keep that dedicated bike line out of here. I said, you know, and I said, you know, you're riding, you know, this is like, it's not safe, Chris. It was not, you know, there was, you know, big 18-wheelers, you know, lots of traffic, not safe for pedestrians, not safe for bicyclists as well. And he just said, you know, they're in the midst of, you know, severe gentrification. They said, you know, that just is going to accelerate things here. And we need time to figure it out because we're trying to put up a fight here, and that's not going to help. And that was, obviously a very sad state for, he was there bicycling with his 2-year-old daughter on the back. And that was hard to sort of take, but that's the reality. And so, no pressure on my colleagues, since again, I have very little of these, but, we had to put in place very deliberately in our guidance, and there may be some constraints for us in the federal government here, but explicit, displacement and gentrification criteria or guidance that try to sort of address that. And if you do that now under the auspice of Justice40, it gives us a better shot of that spreading throughout the other programs. And in California, that's exactly what happened. We had a provision on gentrification on our affordable housing sustainable communities program. Dealt with this combo, housing and transportation, but we put in displacement and gentrification sort of guidance that then allowed the other programs at our housing department to sort of incorporate. And so, to the commenter, and I would say this, that we all know this, and Chris spoke about it, the drivers of how this all happens, and to think that, one project will drive it, but it's a combination of a lot of things that are driving these issues, and it's much more complex. But anyway, just wanted to throw that in.
Are there other perspectives on both the question of capacity and on the question of gentrification? Because it does speak to the point of how the market acts when a place becomes more desirable to live in, and the consequences of that, which Christopher brought up. So I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. And there was a question about whether there is whether there are geographical priorities in terms of where certain infrastructures, for example, things like EV charging infrastructure should go, that are sort of alongside environmental justice goals, just because there are network effects there. So if you could speak to that, Christopher.
Sorry, my internet just went out. Could you repeat that last sentence?
Yeah. So how do you allocate infrastructure investments spatially? Because there's questions of corridors, there's questions of network effects, which may not necessarily be captured by screening tools, since some of the investment must go in interconnections between communities and not necessarily within them.
No, that is actually a great question. Like one of the challenges that we have, right? You can imagine a highway project, right? Doesn't just go through one census tract. It may go through a corridor of census tracts. And how do you equate the benefits versus the disadvantage benefit from that investment? And that is, again, a challenge that we have. One of the approaches that we're trying to, and again, I'll just say it's not easy, and I don't think we have it figured out just yet. But one of the things that we're trying to do in our, for example, our discretionary funding, we're really encouraging applicants to take a holistic approach about the existing environment that they're trying to either improve, retrofit, and the like. And that's a level of data that we, unfortunately, at the department just don't have. We don't have that longitudinal aspect or corridor aspect. We're really relying on the applicant to provide that for us. So that's one way we're getting at that. And through that, we're actually able to then, I think, learn and actually do a level of analysis to determine whether or not, let's say, for example, if a highway expansion or a transit line expansion or a bike trail or a port infrastructure investment really is going to improve not only the corridor or meet some of the Justice40 principles. The other piece here I will say is that on the formula side, it's just really hard for us to do that level. I mean, that is really decentralized down to the state DOTs, to the transit agencies. And I think that is one of the questions still remaining, because a lot of these investments are going to non-federal, going to state and local. How do we capture those that impact in a shorter window? Because oftentimes we are doing our assessment based on 5 to 10 year, information. How can we get that information greater and impact of that information in a quicker timeline? And we just don't have that feedback loop as a department on an ongoing basis. And it's something that's we're just trying to address, at this time. But again, it is a gap in our analysis. But I think most part for our discretionary, we are really relying on the applicant to provide that long-term or that corridor view that we can then do through our own analysis to determine whether or not it's a benefit cost, there's a benefit cost, or it meets our larger equity goals.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And with that, I think we're at time. Thank you for a wonderful discussion. Thank you to the participants for a really interesting set of questions. And I think I will now hand it to Gabe for the next panel. Thank you very much.